Hello, it's Maria from Still Dreaming Homestead. Glad to be back with you, and I'm going to read another story out of this book, Little Cabin by the River by Joyce Neal. And if you haven't seen yet what she looked like, there she is. Chapter 3, Old Time Religion. Back in the olden days, where we lived, going to Sabbath school and church was a lot different from the way it is today. On nice days, we could walk to church if we wanted to, or if we didn't have a car. Our tiny white church was actually a one-room schoolhouse during the week. On Friday afternoons, someone would push aside all the desks and fill the room with folding chairs for Sabbath services. The teacher's desk sat on a little platform one step higher than the student's desk, and that was where the preacher stood to give sermons. My favorite part was the Sabbath school, of course. The grown-ups got to meet in the schoolroom because there was more of them. But we kindergartners got to walk to Mrs. Randall's house. She lived next door to the church, which was probably about 2 city blocks away on the prairie. First, we would gather at church around the potbelly stove in the back of the room and sing the songs the grown-ups sang. After the song service, we children would follow our teachers to various places for Sabbath school. Going to Mrs. Randall's house often turned into a real frolic. What does that mean, do you think? Let's see if we can find out. She always lined us up neatly before we left the schoolhouse. But just a few steps outside our neat little line, we would start to straggle. You see, all kinds of things distracted us. Bugs, snakes, caterpillars, wildflowers, birds. They all required investigation. So by the time we reached the barbed wire fence on the other side of the field, we weren't in a line anymore. In fact, we were often scattered all over between the sagebrush and the tumbleweeds. Now, Mrs. Randall was a very nice and kind lady, but the one thing she didn't like was straggly children. How did we know this? Because we had learned that if we straggled too far, we'd have to wiggle through the barbed wire fence without Mrs. Randall's help, and nobody wanted to do that. The big rubber band. You see, the fence wires were covered with sharp, twisted barbs that could tear your clothes, snag your hair, or worse yet, make deep scratches in your skin that stung and bled. Mrs. Randall would pull apart the fence wire so we would step through without getting hurt. But she wasn't going to stand there all day, by crackety, and if you dawdled, well, let's just say it wasn't always pretty. Now, I know it was shockingly rude, but at the time I was just terribly fascinated when Mrs. Randall held the wires. You see, she was not exactly fat. She was like what people call pleasantly plump. And that's the way I saw her too. She laughed easily, and that made her eyes sparkle. She told wonderful stories, hugged us each and every Sabbath, and was a very patient and loving teacher. But here's the thing. When she put her foot on the bottom wire and pulled the next one up with her hand, her dress would hang oddly. And in those days, the ladies had to wear dresses to church with long stockings. Ladies and gentlemen, too, had to wear a garter to hold up their long stockings, or their stockings would slide down their legs. So a garter was something that pinched onto the top of the stocking and held it up. Now, the garters Mrs. Randall wore were like big rubber bands. She'd pull the garter around her leg at the top of the stocking, and rolled it down with her stockings tucked in all around it. But to my young eyes, her pleasingly plump leg looked rather like a sausage squeezed in two. I thought it must hurt horribly, and I wasn't sure I wanted to ever grow up if I had to wear a contraption like that. I was simply amazed that she still had a smile on her face, considering all the pain she must be in. But speaking of pain, if we dawdled too long, Mrs. Randall would leave her post at the fence and lead the ones who made it in time across the yard, while the stragglers would panic and try to dive through the fence at the very last moment before she let go of the wires. I usually made it in time. In her living room, Mrs. Randall would have everything ready for us. The regular furniture was pushed back against the wall, and the sand table stood in the middle, surrounded by 6 small chairs and 1 big one. A picture roll hung on a tall metal stand next to Mrs. Randall's chair. We don't use picture rolls much in Sabbath anymore. Now everyone uses felt sets to help tell Bible stories. Felt would be a type of material that will stick to other material, and so you can make a scene like a picture. But back then we used picture rolls every week. The picture roll were made of big sheets of paper, 13 of them, on which the memory verse for the Sabbath was written. Each sheet had a beautiful picture printed on it that illustrated the Bible verse, and they were held together at the top by a metal clip and hung from a stand by a cord. When the teacher finished the lesson one week, she'd lift that page and turn it over on the top of the backside, and the memory verse for next week would appear. We were given little memory verse cards each week that looked just like the big picture roll. We took those cards home with us and collected them into sets. They really helped us learn the Bible verses for the quarter, and they were a treat that we looked forward to every week. I loved the sand table. You may never have seen one before, so I'll tell you how it worked. When it was closed, it looked like any other table, but you could open it by putting your finger in a little hole at the top of the table and lifting up. Now, the top of the table was a box about 4 inches deep, filled with soft sand. The cover had 2 halves, and when you lifted them, they would fold down flat against the edges of the table, leaving the sandbox open and ready to use. We weren't allowed to play in the sand. Instead, the teacher would use it to help tell a Bible story. She had Bible characters printed on stiff paper, front and back, with tabs on their feet that she pushed into the sand so they'd stand straight up. In a little paper bag, she kept other items such as rocks and twigs and moss that she'd use to represent bushes and trees. She even had a little mirror to make rivers or lakes in the sand, and a real toy boat to set on the water. Sometimes she would let us help move the Bible characters around too. Then, when the story was over, Mrs. Randall would lift the lid and close the table so that we could color our pictures on it. Next, she would ask each of us to say our memory verse for that week. As a reward, we were given stickers to paste on the front of our Little Friend magazine. When Sabbath school was over, we'd climb back through the fence and trek along the sagebrush to the church. I didn't like church as much as I did Sabbath school because the sermon was long and I didn't really understand it. I tried very hard to listen quietly, but I didn't seem to be made that way. My legs were too short to reach the floor, and they start to hurt after a while. I'd wiggle so a different part of my leg would rest on the chair's edge, and sometime Mama would let me stand up for a while. She would take her white hanky out of her purse. That would be kind of like what we would use a Kleenex for now, but they were made of material, and rolled it up to make a soft baby in a cradle, and that would amuse me for a little while. Then Daddy would lift me on his lap so that I could see what was happening up front. I still couldn't see very well though, and pretty soon his wool suit began to make my legs itch, so I'd start wiggling again. I think it must have been tiring for all of us. But then the good part would come as everyone stood to sing the closing song. I would stand on my chair then. I knew all the songs that the grown-ups did, so I'd sing with gusto. After church, all the grown-ups would stand around talking. Once outside, we children would run and talk again. Sometimes somebody would ask us to have lunch with them. Other times, Mama would invite another family to come to our house, and we'd have a glorious afternoon together. Once in a while, everyone would hurry to their own homes for a quick lunch, and then meet back somewhere to hike through the rocky hills, search for fossils, or enjoy the park, just like you'd probably do today. Some things have changed all right, but Sabbath activities still warm my heart today, just as they did way back then. How about you? Well, if you get to go to Sabbath school, or maybe you go to Sunday school, what is your favorite part of it? And do you have any special things that you do after church? Now at our church, 2 times a month, we have a potluck. And a potluck is where everybody brings some food from home. Oh, it might be a hot dish, or potatoes, a salad. I like to take pineapple upside down cake. And then we all eat together on big long tables and visit with each other for a long, long time. Then the children go outside and play when they're done. Unless it's raining, then they get to play inside. Well, it's Maria from Still Dreaming Homestead. I want to say I love you. I really do. And I pray blessings on you and yours in your house, and when you're out of the house, in the day and in the night. Whatever you do, keep dreaming. All right. Bye-bye.